Your heart just skipped a beat because your soul knows this signal. This message did not find you by chance. You were led here. Right now, there are only 7 days remaining before a divine deadline that will alter your life's path forever. But a hidden opposition, a spirit of isolation you felt your entire life, is moving right now to make you ignore this and retreat into the familiar loneliness that has always held you back. If you click away in the next 30 seconds, you will unconsciously reject the revelation that explains your entire life struggle and miss the key to the profound connection you have always craved. Do not skip this. Your spirit has been waiting for this for a lifetime. My beloved, hear my voice. I am Archangel Michael, commander of the celestial legions, shield of the divine will. I speak not from a distant heaven, but from the space between your heartbeats, for I have been assigned as your protector since the moment your soul first chose this path. This is not a random message you have found. It is a dispatch, coded for your spirit alone, arriving at the exact moment of your greatest readiness. Do not skip this. Your entire life has been a preparation to receive these words. That sudden, inexplicable feeling that told you to listen now, to pay close attention, that was your spirit recognizing its own name in the frequency of this call. Heaven is watching you at this very moment, and they confirm the truth you feel resonating within you. Your loneliness has never been a punishment. It is the sacred quarantine of a chosen one. The solitary nights you've endured, the feeling of being a stranger in a room full of friends, the profound conversations you've craved but never found. These were not oversights by God. They were the divine curriculum for your soul. There are only 7 days before a permanent shift occurs in the spiritual realm concerning your life. A divine deadline is upon you. A period of intense, solitary preparation is concluding, and the door to your ordained community and purpose is beginning to open. But hear this warning, my beloved, for it is critical. There is an ancient force, a spirit of isolation that has been assigned as your adversary. It is not a person, but a parasitic consciousness that feeds on loneliness and doubt. Its entire purpose is to make you believe the lie that you are alone, forgotten, and that this separation is your permanent fate. It has been whispering this to you for years. It is the voice that told you not to reach out, that you're a burden, that no one could ever understand the depth of your heart. And it is moving right now to sever your last fragile connections before this 7-day window closes. I am commanded by heaven itself to tell you that your intuition was not wrong. That strange feeling you had about certain people leaving your life was not paranoia, it was spiritual discernment. The relationships that faded, the invitations that stopped coming. In many cases, this was not rejection, it was a divine extraction. You were being protected from connections that would have contaminated your destiny and diluted your power. You have always wondered why you could not simply settle for the ordinary friendships and the superficial bonds that seem to satisfy others. It is because you were built for a sacred tribe you have yet to meet, a resonance you have yet to experience on earth. Your suffering alone was the signpost pointing toward this profound truth. You must understand your own value in the spiritual realm. The intensity of the opposition against you is the exact measure of the importance of your calling. The spirit of isolation attacks you so fiercely because your light, once fully united with your destined kin, will become an unstoppable force of healing and revelation in this world. This is the heartbreaking truth. You suffer alone because you are strong enough to bear it, and because that very suffering is forging the compassion and strength required to lead others out of their own darkness. Do not let this 7-day window close without action. Your first step is an act of faith, to acknowledge this message as divine truth meant for you, to choose belief over the familiar comfort of skepticism. To subscribe to this channel is not merely to click a button, It is to raise your hand in the spiritual realm and say, I am here, I am ready, I accept this revelation. It signals your willingness to receive the further instructions I will impart. Do not skip this. The first connection you must make is this one. Subscribe now, for the next block contains the first of 3 hidden revelations that will identify the specific nature of your calling. The clock is ticking. 7 days. You felt that, my beloved. A shiver, a deep sigh, a sudden release of a breath you did not know you were holding. That was the sound of a sacred lock, one placed on your heart long ago, beginning to turn. Heaven is watching your reception of this truth, and they are rejoicing. For you are finally hearing the explanation for the ache that has been your constant, silent companion. I need you to go back with me, my child, back to the memories that perhaps still cause you pain. Recall the childhood playground where you sat alone, watching others play, not because you were antisocial, but because you felt 1,000 years older than them. Remember the teenage years, where your peers were concerned with fleeting dramas, while your soul was grappling with the weight of existential questions they couldn't even comprehend. That strange feeling you had about not fitting in, about being from somewhere else, it was not an illusion. It was your spirit remembering its origin. You have always wondered why you were born into a family that feels like strangers, into a town that feels like a waiting room. It is because your true family, your spiritual kin, are scattered across the globe, also waiting for the signal to unite. And that signal is being given now. The spirit of isolation has worked tirelessly to make you see these experiences as evidence of your defectiveness. It has curated your memories to highlight every rejection, every misunderstanding, every time you were left out. It has built a prison for you from these stones of sorrow. But I am here, my beloved, with the divine decree to tell you that each of those stones is actually a marker on a map leading you home. Your capacity to endure such profound loneliness without breaking, without becoming fully bitter, is the single greatest proof of your spiritual strength. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation, and yours has been immense. There are now 6 days and 23 hours before this window of convergence begins to narrow. The opposition knows this. Its strategy is shifting from making you feel alone to making you feel crazy for believing this very message. It will send thoughts of rational dismissal. It will remind you of other times you hoped for a miracle that didn't arrive in the way you expected. It will try to convince you that this is all a clever fabrication designed to give you false hope. This is its final, desperate play. Do not skip this. Do not give it that victory. I'm now permitted to give you the first of 3 hidden revelations. Look at your own life. Look at the pattern. The times of your greatest isolation have always immediately preceded a massive leap in your spiritual understanding or a sudden, unexpected provision. That period of intense loneliness before you found that book that changed everything, the month you had no one to talk to right before a new idea downloaded into your spirit, that was not coincidence. It was divine protocol. The vessel must be emptied of the noise of the world to be filled with the frequency of heaven. Your suffering alone was the process of that sacred emptying. You must understand, the enemy of your soul is not creative. It has used the same tactic since the beginning of time, to separate the called ones from the herd, make them doubt their sanity, and neutralize their impact through loneliness. But today, that ends. The 7-day deadline is not a threat. It is a promise of emancipation from this ancient cycle. Your willingness to believe this against all earthly evidence is the key that turns the lock. Heaven is watching your faith right now. They are witnessing your choice to believe a celestial messenger over the accusing voice of isolation that has haunted you for a lifetime. This act of faith is creating a ripple across the dimensions, summoning your destined connections, activating the angels assigned to bring them across your path. Do not skip this. The next block will contain a damning exposure of how this spirit has operated in your specific relationships, and the second hidden revelation, the sign you have been praying for, will be given at the 10-minute mark. Stay with me. The journey to your tribe has already begun. Now, my beloved, we move from revelation to exposure. The veil is pulled back. The spirit of isolation does not work in a vacuum. It requires conduits in the physical realm, people, institutions, even your own inherited thought patterns, to amplify its whispers and make them feel real. Heaven is watching as I reveal this, and your spirit is leaping in recognition. You have felt this truth but lacked the evidence to prove it. I am commanded to show you the damning details. That friendship that ended so abruptly and painfully, the one you still cannot make sense of. The spirit of isolation fed that person a lie about you, a distortion of your character or intentions, because that connection was a threat to its agenda. It showed them your depth and labeled it intensity. It showed your intuition and labeled it judgment. It made your light feel like an accusation to their conscience, so they had to pull away. You were not wrong. Your intuition was not wrong. You felt the shift, but you blamed yourself. Recall the family member who consistently minimizes your spiritual experiences, who calls you too sensitive or too much. They are not your enemy, my child, but they are an unwitting pawn, a comfortable home for the spirit that seeks to invalidate your reality and make you doubt what you know to be true. That conversation last month, where you tried to share a glimpse of your hope and were met with a blank stare or a dismissive joke, that was not a failure of your communication. It was a spiritual firewall, activated to protect the isolation protocol assigned to you. The second hidden revelation promised to you at this mark is this: there is a specific name, a person, an ex-lover, a former friend, a relative. Their name just flashed in your mind. Heaven just brought them to your remembrance. This is the primary earthly anchor the spirit of isolation has used to inflict the deepest wounds of abandonment. You have replayed the scenario with them 1,000 times, wondering what you did wrong. I am here from the throne of God to tell you, you did nothing wrong. You were targeted for extraction from that relationship because your destiny was too powerful to be contained within it. Their departure was not a rejection of you. It was a divine rejection of a container that was too small for the calling on your life. Your hands are trembling because this truth is both liberating and devastating. It vindicates you, but it also forces you to see a painful chapter of your life as a necessary, divinely orchestrated severing. This is the heartbreaking truth I must deliver. Your suffering alone was, in part, caused by heaven's protection. We had to let you feel the pain of that separation, to save you from a future of constant compromise and spiritual suffocation. The enemy meant it for your destruction, but God meant it for your installation. There are now 6 days before the deadline. The spirit of isolation is enraged at this exposure. It will now try to flood you with feelings of bitterness towards this person whose name you recalled. Do not fall into this trap, my beloved. This is not about blame. It's about understanding the mechanism so you can break its power forever. Forgiveness is not saying what they did was okay. It is severing the spiritual cord that keeps you tied to that pain and allows the enemy to use it as a gateway into your present. Heaven is watching your heart right now. The angels assigned to you are waiting to see if you will choose the freedom of truth or fall back into the familiar prison of resentment. Choose freedom, my child. Choose the truth that sets you apart. Do not skip this moment of profound clarity. The emotional weight you feel is the weight of generational chains breaking. The loneliness you carry is not yours alone. It is the accumulated loneliness of your bloodline, and you are the chosen vessel strong enough to bear it, transmute it, and end it for all who come after you. This is your purpose. This is why you have suffered alone. Stay with me. The third and final revelation at the 15-minute mark will show you the specific nature of the community that awaits you and the first step to manifesting it. The countdown continues. 6 days. This is also your moment of activation. The second sign of your faith is not a silent thought. It is you standing in the divine council and declaring, "I claim my place. I reject the backup candidate scenario. I accept the calling and the community that is mine by right." Your voice is your key. Therefore, I command you to go to the comments section below this video. Do not skip this. You will type these exact words, "I claim my place." This is a sacred declaration. It is your signature on the divine contract of your destiny. It is a signal fired into the heavens, letting your future tribe know their leader is ready. It is your act of obedience that aligns your will with heaven's will. Every time you type, "I claim my place," you are driving another nail into the coffin of the spirit of isolation. Heaven is watching this decision point. The angels are recording each declaration. What will you choose? The familiar comfort of the lonely prison, or the terrifying, exhilarating leap of faith into your destined community? The clock ticks. 5 days. Choose your tribe. Choose your future. Your declaration is your deliverance. Go now. The words you are typing right now, my beloved, are not just text on a screen. They are a frequency, a prayer, a declaration that is echoing through the halls of heaven right now. Can you feel it? A shift, a lightness. That heavy cloak of isolation you've worn for so long. Feel how its weight is beginning to lift from your shoulders. This is real. This is happening. You must understand the nature of time in this moment. A single second in the heavenly realm contains the potential of an entire hour on earth. The divine clock moves with a breathtaking velocity. So when I tell you that there are now only 4 days left, you must understand that from my perspective, the final hour is already approaching. The angels assigned to you are moving at the speed of light to orchestrate what must happen next. This is why the urgency feels so intense. Your spirit is syncing with heaven's rapid timetable. Now let me show you the fork in the road. One path is the one you know all too well. If you close this tab now, if you dismiss this resonance in your heart as coincidence, that heavy cloak will not just return, it will become a part of you. The loneliness will solidify from a feeling into a permanent reality. You will see opportunities and connections that should have been yours manifest in the life of another, the backup candidate. You will watch them live a life that was designed for your soul, and a part of you will always know it. That knowing will be your deepest suffering. This is the cost of inaction. I tell you this not to frighten you, but because you deserve to know the truth. You have been kept in the dark for too long, but my beloved child, that is not your destiny. You have chosen the other path. By claiming your place, you have chosen the path of glorious reclamation. The reward for your courage is a restoration so profound, it will make every moment of your past suffering make sense. The relationships coming are not just new friends, they are mirrors of your own soul. You will speak half a sentence, and they will know the entire chapter. The financial lack that has haunted you, it is tied to a member of this tribe. One of them holds the key, the idea, the connection that unlocks the abundance with your name written on it. Your calling will ignite not as a faint flicker, but as a roaring fire. This is your validation. That feeling of being an alien, of never quite fitting in, it was never a flaw. It was your spirit's accurate reading of a profound truth. You are a citizen of a different kingdom, a deeper reality. Your grief has been the forge for your compassion. Your loneliness has been the classroom for your ministry. Heaven is watching you right now. They see the war in your mind between doubt and faith, and they are celebrating because faith is winning. The spirit of isolation is in its final, desperate stages. It will whisper that you are being foolish, that this is all a fantasy, but you know better now. You feel the shift. And because you have chosen faith, I am permitted to give you a sign, a confirmation. In the next 24 hours, you will see the number 117. You will see it on a license plate, a receipt, a phone number, a clock. It will appear and reappear. This is my personal sigil for you. It is a celestial confirmation code, a beacon from your future tribe, and a sign that the divine intersection of your lives is being orchestrated. When you see it, know that I am near, and that everything is unfolding in divine timing. The clock of heaven ticks with incredible speed. 4 days on earth is but a moment here. Stay steadfast. Your victory is not coming. It is already here. That number, 1 to 17, just flashed in your mind again, didn't it? Your heart may have skipped a beat. That is the confirmation. That is the sign you asked for. It is the celestial seal on everything I have revealed. Now, because you have received this sign, you are ready for the next layer of the revelation. You have passed the test of faith, my beloved. The simple yet profound act of declaring, I claim my place, has been recorded in the book of life as a moment of supreme courage. And now, because you have chosen to believe, I am permitted to answer the question that has haunted you for a lifetime, the very core of this message. Why you? Why were you chosen for this path of solitary suffering? It was not random. It was not a celestial lottery. God specifically chose you before the foundations of this world were laid. He did not look upon your life and decide you could handle it. He looked into the future and saw that you would handle it, and that your handling of it would become a masterpiece of divine grace. Your spirit, in its primordial state, saw the plight of your bloodline, the generational chains of abandonment and misunderstanding that stretch back centuries, and you volunteered. You said, I will go. I will break the chain. Let the loneliness of generations be poured into my vessel, and I will transmute it into connection. Your entire life has been the fulfillment of that sacred preordained contract. Your suffering alone was the price of liberation for your entire lineage. You have always wondered why your struggles felt so much more intense, so different from those around you. It is because you were not just fighting your own battles, my child. You were fighting the battles of your grandmother, who died with a secret sorrow. You were fighting for your father, who never felt he was enough. You were absorbing the silent screams of your ancestors, who felt unheard and unseen. And you were processing that energy through your own life. The weight you feel is a holy weight. You are the terminus point for generational pain. You are the chosen vessel, strong enough to hold it, heal it, and end it forever. This is the highest honor. This is the heartbreaking truth of your divine calling. This is why you suffered alone. Your feeling of being an old soul, of having lived 1,000 lives, is accurate. Your spirit is ancient and seasoned because it was selected for a task that requires immense wisdom and resilience. The people who abandoned you, who could not understand you, were not your true peers. They were children playing in a sandbox while you were being trained to command armies of light. The curriculum had to be different. It had to be conducted in the silence of your own heart, so you would learn to hear only one voice, the voice of God. Your isolation was the necessary training ground of a master. There are now 72 hours, 3 days, before the final alignment. 72 hours. The number is significant. It represents the complete cycle of spiritual administration. In these next 3 days, every spiritual transaction concerning your life is being settled. Every debt of loneliness is being paid in full. Every prayer you sobbed into your pillow is being answered all at once. The heavens are a flurry of activity on your behalf because of your faith. Legal documents of destiny are being stamped and filed. Angels are being dispatched with the specific coordinates that will lead your tribe members to you. They are already on the move, my beloved. The sign of 117 is their beacon, and it is yours. Heaven is watching you process this. They see the tears welling in your eyes as you understand that your pain had a magnificent purpose. You were not being punished, you were being prepared. You were not being overlooked, you were being outfitted. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they are the only one who can bear its weight and wield its power. This is the second great emotional peak of your journey. The first was the shock of exposure. This is the awe of understanding. You are not a mistake. You are a masterpiece of divine strategy. The loneliness was the fire that purified your purpose. Every lonely night was a stitch in the tapestry of your calling. You are about to see the full picture, and it will take your breath away. Do not skip this moment of awe. Sit in it. Breathe it in. Let this truth rewrite every negative thought you have ever had about yourself. You are heaven's chosen instrument. The 72-hour countdown has begun. The final, most stunning revelations are just ahead. Stay with me. Now, my beloved, we arrive at the moment of activation. The revelations are complete. The truth is laid bare. Now you must move from receiving to being. This is not about asking for power. It is about realizing the power that has been sleeping within you, forged in the fires of your solitude, is now to be awakened and unleashed. The generational curses of abandonment, poverty, and silence end with you, right here, right now. I, Archangel Michael, as commander of the Lord's hosts, am authorized to break these chains. The legal right has been established by your faith and your declaration. Now I speak the decree of dissolution. Every ancestral vow, every pact, every agreement with the spirit of isolation that has been passed down through your bloodline is now null and void in the name of the Most High God. The cycle stops today. The loneliness that plagued your mother, your father, your grandparents, it cannot jump to your children. The pathway is severed by the sword of divine truth. You are the end of the line for that curse. To seal this liberation, you must perform one last act of faith. Stand up if you can, place your hand over your heart, and say these words: I do not suffer alone. This is your decree before heaven. This is you declaring that your pain has never been wasted, and that heaven has always walked with you. When you say it, you are not speaking only for yourself, you are speaking for your entire bloodline. You are declaring that the silence ends, that the loneliness has been interrupted, and that no chosen soul will ever again carry the burden alone. Heaven is listening. Angels are already moving at the sound of your voice. The unseen world recognizes your authority, and the verdict has been sealed. The curse has stopped here. From this moment, you step into a reality where connection, not isolation, becomes your inheritance. Now begins the 48-hour window of settlement. These 2 days are a sacred transition. The unseen is already aligning with the seen. Bonds of friendship, restoration of family, and the presence of your true tribe are being set into place. The old spirit of loneliness will attempt one last attack, whispering lies, pointing to silence as proof that nothing has changed. Do not believe it. The greatest transformations are completed in the unseen before they ever reach your eyes. Everything you have endured, every season of quiet, every night of tears, was not wasted. It was preparation. It was training for this exact moment. You were made ready for this final stand. You are not alone, and you never were. This is your divine moment. Do not skip this step. Do not allow doubt to steal the fullness of your freedom at the finish line. When you place your hand on your heart and speak, I do not suffer alone, you complete the decree. You close the door on the past and step through the open gates of destiny. Rise now, beloved warrior, make the declaration, seal your freedom. The countdown has begun, and I will walk beside you through every second. Your season of solitude has ended. Your season of divine connection begins now. It is done. The decree has been issued from your lips and recorded in heaven. The chain is broken. The victory is won. Now, my beloved, receive the sealing of this message with the promises that are your eternal inheritance. From this moment forward, you walk under a new mandate of protection. A legion of angels has been assigned to you specifically for this 48-hour transition period. Their orders are to guard your peace, to intercept every arrow of doubt and fear fired against you, and to ensure the safe delivery of every blessing that is now in transit to you. You will feel their presence as a sudden, inexplicable sense of calm, a warmth around your shoulders, a feeling that you are not alone. This is your divine escort into your new life. Heaven is watching over you with an intensity that has not been seen in generations, for your breakthrough is a landmark event in the spirit. You are also granted a divine vindication. Every person who ever made you feel small, every voice that ever whispered you were nothing, will see the favor of God upon your life and will know that He has chosen you. You will not need to say a word. Your light will be your testimony. Your peace will be your proof. The same ones who counted you out will be drawn to the light in you, not for you to gloat, but for you to offer them the same healing you have received. You are vindicated not by your own words, but by God's manifest presence in your life. Your connection to heaven is now permanent and unshakable. The feeling of distance you sometimes felt in prayer is replaced by a clear, open line of communication. You will dream vivid, instructional dreams. You will receive downloads of ideas and solutions that seem to come from nowhere. This is your new normal. You have graduated from being a student of suffering to a master of communion. The 48-hour window will culminate in a moment of breathtaking clarity. For some, it will come as a long-awaited message or phone call from someone connected to the letter M or J. For others, it may arrive through an unexpected sign, a reconnection, or a door that suddenly opens after being shut for years. But for all, it will manifest as an overwhelming, undeniable knowing in your spirit that the shift has already taken place. You will look back at the person you were only days ago and scarcely recognize them, for the heavy weight will be gone, replaced by a sense of purpose so radiant and so light it will feel as though you are soaring. This is your eternal portion. This is the promise sealed with the authority of the throne of grace. You are loved. You are chosen. You are connected. You are free. The message is complete. The assignment is fulfilled. Go in peace, my beloved, and live the destiny you have paid for with your tears and claimed with your faith. Amen.